All right, I will slowly start with introductions so as to not steal more time away from our wonderful speakers who are gathered here to have a really fun discussion with all of us. I'm here as the facilitator for this wonderful sessions about the conditions that we create for creativity. The headline speaker here is Pirini Sundaralingam, who joins us all the way from San Francisco. I met Pirini, gosh, so long ago, 2015, at a very different occasion also about creativity, where she presented a gorgeous poem and was speaking about her process in coming up and generating that poem. Little did I know that Pirini had so many other hats that she wore. She's a genuine polymath, a playwright, an activist, a consultant for all matters in relation to and touch on creativity and the imagination somehow. So she is, and by training, a cognitive neuroscientist and is now a behavior change expert who uses her expertise to leverage latest scientific findings to drive strategy and human-centered design in the workplace and beyond. And so her research focuses on decision making, attention, and human creativity, and how we can essentially optimize these for human potential. So this kind of initiatives that they do has positioned her kind of uniquely to lead behavior change initiatives across many fields, from humane tech to climate change, to organizational development. So she has conducted cognitive research at MIT and Oxford, as well as leading research programs at Silicon Valley Center for Humane Technology. As principal advisor on human potential at the United Nations Museum, she spearheaded strategies on behavioral change around key global challenges and is currently the interdisciplinary catalyst at Oxford University's oldest college. And you have to tell us which one that is, Pirini. As well as being the founder and CEO of Neuroresilience Consulting. So really lots of different hats that Pirini wears. Joining us in this panel discussion are two people I've had most excellent conversations with when it comes to creativity. One is Professor Elizabeth King, the Associate Professor at UGA, the University of Georgia, and she has a joint appointment in two schools, the Odum School of Ecology and the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. Her undergrad degree was from Reed College and is in biology, and her master's and PhD was from the UC Davis in population biology. Her primary areas, among her many areas of focus, include community and ecosystem ecology, social ecological systems, resilience, and sustainability science. And finally, the third person we have on this panel is Mark Callahan, the artistic director of the newly named UGA Arts Collaborative, an absolutely incredible interdisciplinary initiative for advanced research in the arts at the University of Georgia. Also serves on the faculty of the School of Art. He is a graduate of the Cranbrook Academy of Art and the Rhode Island School of Design, where he was a member of the European Honors Program in Rome, in Italy. Mark's work has been included in exhibitions all over the place, including at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, Club Internet, the Showroom for Media and Moving Art in the Netherlands, and the Telfair Museum in Savannah, Georgia, and has been used in concert by the band we're all obsessed with in the city, REM, as a large-scale video projection, which is incredibly super cool. He is a co-principal investigator, I think, with Lizzie, on enhancing imaginative and collaborative STEM capacity through creative inquiry, which is an arts and STEM graduate workshop project that is supported by the National Science Foundation. So we have got all these three wonderful people here to talk about because the conversations that I have had with them have revolved around creativity and how to nurture creativity. And a lot of similar elements seem to come up in our conversations. Pirini's focus at the moment is on physical spaces and what that does to encourage or deter creativity. And Mark and Lizzie essentially have all of the interactions I've had with them has really, really focused on practice and process. And I would like for each of them to share their views on conditions that are great for creativity in enhancing us recognizing each of our potentials. We'll start with Pirini giving us a little presentation about where her position is.
So much, Hannah, and I'm delighted to be on this panel with such esteemed colleagues. So thank you very much for this fantastic opportunity. So I'm just going to start with brief for 3 or 4 minutes, just give an overview that I think will help synthesize all of our respective perspectives, or will allow a platform for us all to join in, and to basically set some questions. So let's start by looking at the fact that Harvard Business Review recently pointed to a dramatic deficit in imagination in the business world. There's been, and that's definitely been further enhanced by the process of so many of us going through lockdown, going through COVID. And this has become such a serious issue that it's something that several management consultancies have weighed in on. How do we enhance creativity in the workplace, imagination? So my offering today is to explore how the appliance of science can overcome, tackle, and reverse this imagination deficit. And I really feel that it's essential that we embrace the flood of information coming into information about this area. I come into this, as Anna said, as I am a trained cognitive scientist. I'm very aware of the data, and yet there seems to be this gap between what scientists such as, neuroscientists such as Anna, the kind of work they're working on, cognitive science in the area, and the gap between what's happening in the business world and in other and in the classroom. So to point to a couple of, we can look at some very popular solutions, for example. When we think about enhancing creativity in the workplace, it's very common to have a retreat. People go to a special, wonderful place, have a retreat, the company retreat, and it may or may not enhance creativity, but it's at that moment and in that context. What it doesn't necessarily do is that when you go back to your workplace in your original conditions and context, that your creativity is still enhanced. So that popular solution is one that I would kind of say that we really need to look at it in a more nuanced way. We can point to the idea that there's a lot, that the exposure to many, many new images, thanks to social media, for example, the idea of being exposed to a lot of new visual images and sounds may increase our creativity. But then when you turn to cognitive scientists' data, such as the work of Howard Gardner at Harvard, he's actually looked at creativity very specifically and showed that what you do see is that whilst you may have an increase in what we call fluency, which is the number of images being generated, the originality of those images actually drops. So the ideas behind that, the idea of jumping to, so the kinds of processes that we need to truly solve problems are actually diminished. So this is where it's so important, point number one, to look at the importance of working with scientists who've already parsed the field. So we don't just use this general term creativity, but we say, well, what are we looking at? Great, exposure to social media images enhances fluency, increases the frequency of how much you can output, but it's not increasing originality. And scientists have very clearly separated these components of creativity. So we think about creativity in a much more nuanced way, and then look at the impacts of any types of potential solutions we have or any potential trainings. Another example of this, for example, is that architects have jumped into the idea of the open office plan that has, very popular, the idea that it enhances creativity. Well, it enhances interaction. But is that the same as creativity? Does it actually enhance originality of thought, for example? So again, parsing the idea of what is it that we're trying to measure, and to really think a little bit more in a much more nuanced way about creativity is something I'd urge. And to really put the science, engage with the science, embrace the science, and start using some of these nuances. So in my work with organizations, I've been very excited to help them think through this and to really, to be data driven, to use evidence-based design so that we can really build not just a culture of creativity in organizations and the workplace, but a long-term culture, not just the once-off retreat. So I'd like to point to two areas that I think are useful to think about. So firstly, the idea of space. Quite often when we think about creativity or creativity trainings, we're looking at the brain. It's almost as if the individual brain is floating without any connection to other human beings or to the space it's in. But there's some very interesting work coming out. So Kornberger's work talks about, let's look at the building, and let's not just think about open plan. Let's look at what he talks about as the generative building. And to summarize that work, he points to the importance of a building whose architectural design allows for two key things. One, surprising or random encounters with other people. And I know my esteemed colleagues on the panel are nodding because I think this is really an area that they have a lot to say about. So surprising encounters, a generative building is one that allows for surprising encounters on the walkway, in the stairwell, at lunch. But it also allows for spaces of privacy. So that's very different from the idea of the open plan office. So why is that important? Well, firstly, again, looking at creativity models from a scientific point of view, we know that creativity has multiple stages. It's not one unidimensional big bag of jelly. So there's a phase of incubation. There's a phase of preparation where you're trying to pull in lots of ideas from lots of different spaces. That's a perfect place where you can imagine that collisions with lots of different people or an open plan office might be useful. But stage 2 of creativity is incubation, where you're allowing those ideas to sift and simmer and to really percolate. And there's a lot of data and there's a whole series of stages in creativity. So we can talk about that more perhaps at the panel if people are interested. But each of these stages requires a very different type of physical structure to be in. So it's not one solution fits all. The open plan office does not fit every stage of creativity. So we really need to be quite much more nuanced when we're thinking. And this is how, when I work with organizations, we look at their needs, which aspects of creativity they want to enhance, etc. But this is how we try to use science to really engage with making change. And two thoughts about the Kornberger work. Firstly, so we know that and this is where I think it links to some of the work that Lizzie and Mark do. So we know that organizations suffer from what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. So this is basically when a moderate level of expertise leads to people suddenly dropping in their cognitive flexibility. So you start to become familiar with an area, basically, and you become a little bit more rigid about what you think works. You become less open to other ideas. So that's the Dunning-Kruger effect. And so can we look at the idea that maybe surprising encounters in the generative building is something that then helps to challenge that Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Stops us being stuck in that moment. So, and then another idea to think about is the role of technology. Can we help? Can we really use some of this scientific data to help us rethink our approach to technology in the workplace so that it allows us to calibrate our cognitive processes? So by this, I'm saying, let's use many of the text messaging or social media we might use. Do they allow for surprising encounters? Usually not, because the algorithms drive us into comfortable spaces. So we tend to see the same things. Does it increase privacy? Far from it. It's actually the complete opposite. So that's in terms of social media. But many of the other forms of technology that we use in the workplace are perhaps allowing for a lot of interaction, but not necessarily allowing for incubation. So we need to have a much more nuanced and moderated view to thinking about our digital transformations. It's, again, one size doesn't fit all. And then the last thing I'd like to point to is the work of the connection between attentional scope, as Anna mentioned. I've tended to, in my own research work, focus on attention in the brain. So the attentional scope and creativity. How can we use that data, science data, to build better workplaces? So it's been over 10 years now since Nijstadt talked about the fact, and actually did a lot of laboratory work, experimental manipulations, showing how that if you expand attentional scope so that it's the opposite of detail orientation. If you look and see the big picture and you have some training and practice in that, then there are knock-on effects that can actually stay for quite some time in terms of long-term creativity. And again, let's look at the spaces we're in. Right now, we're in this very small space, not exactly expanding our visual scope, right? And it turns out that when we look at the fantastic advantages of Zoom, that right now, for example, here we are, coast to coast, having a meeting, fantastic advantages. But the development of so much of our technology has focused on speed, efficiency, and unfortunately, often attention extraction. So that's a whole other talk. But using Zoom, so Microsoft Labs came out with a report recently which showed that if you've been on Zoom for more than 30 minutes, there's significant shifts in the way that your brain waves work. And there's actually a downplay in your ability to access divergent thinking and creativity. So here we are using tech that is actually, downgrading us. Because it wasn't designed, it wasn't really human-centered. So let's just take some of those ideas into account. I think of the wonderful data work that just came out a few months ago by Murali and Handel, which talks about restraints. So even sitting in an office chair, if you sit in a very rigid way and fixate on one spot, huge drops in your creativity scores and all types of creativity measures. But if you have a more if you're bobbing around on a ball, which I promise to not do during this panel, then it turns out that there's wonderful transfer effects. And it's very connected to, similarly, taking a walk. If you are on a prescribed path where you are forced to walk, you end up being a lot less creative than if you are doing what is called pre-walking. So we can get into the details of that later. So, but all of this talks about restraint. If you feel that you're stuck, fixated, if your physical environment of your chair or your screen keeps you in a small, limited, fixated space, it's going to have inevitably an impact on your brain. So I'll conclude by saying that there are these, let's take the data that we have and let's try to be much more mindful about the way that we build our solutions and engage with our solutions, rather than having very simplistic ideas of creativity and leading to things that solutions that eventually backfire.
Thank you, Perini. I've noticed some people have written in the chat that they're having problems viewing people. I'm not sure why that is, but we'll try to get to the bottom of that. Everyone seems to be viewing something different, so that's never happened to us before. So I'm sorry about that. Thank you, Perini. That the focus was in Perini's introduction on the importance of space, thoughts about how space affects our capacity to be productive and creative. Lizzie, do you want to chime in on your views in terms of what are the conditions that you think are critical here? Does that align somehow with what Perini has said, or are you taking it someplace else?
Oh, I'm fascinated by all of the things that Perini said, and a lot of literature that I'm not familiar with. Most of my engagement with these concepts has been through collaboration with Mark since coming to UGA. And what's really been exciting about it is and a lot of questions. I have a long list of questions for Perini later. We'll let people in the audience ask questions during this session. But some of the questions that keep coming up in my mind since Mark and I have really been focusing on collaborative creativity is, where are some of these conditions for creativity specific to individuals and sort of being assessed at an individual level versus collective forms of creativity? And so I think it's really, really fascinating to think about creativity as an emergent property that happens among collectives as well as the individuals. And I know very little about those linkages. Our focus has been thinking more about the spaces for creativity in terms of how people relate to one another, and that our relationships with one another provide those surprise moments. So a lot of the things that you were saying about space have analogs in a lot of the conversations that our group has had about relationships. And certainly novelty, but not too much public novelty where people are disoriented and withdraw, that comfort zone. And I was wondering about that with spaces, if there's a point at which novelty becomes saturating. I just can't resist asking you more questions, but our work has really tried to think about, when we have groups of scientists and artists and humanists and non-human entities together, what are the conditions there that open people up to being more creative? What are some of the processes? So I think a lot of what we've been working on has really close parallels to thinking about the space, but we've instead been focusing more on who are the other entities in that space, human and non-human. So Mark can talk about this probably more elaborately, and I think has a lot more familiarity with the parallels between the two, since he is an actual art professor. You want to talk some on that, Mark?
Sure, thank you. There's a lot to think about here. It's really exciting to think about the connections in our shared practices as well. I was thinking about art school, and that art school can be a place of mind-numbing, soul-crushing monotony, bureaucracy, indoctrination. Just because it's art school doesn't mean that it's by definition a creative place. It's a place where there are creative people, but the conditions of an art school can also be anti-creative. And I think artists don't really do themselves any favors by promoting the mystique of art making, by hiding their work, hiding their process, and pretending like it just came out like magic. And even on a campus like this, which is gifted with having robust art programs and people studying the science of creativity literally down the street, that there can be a reluctance to know what's going on behind the creative process, that might somehow break the spell. Intellectually, we know that having access to more knowledge about how creativity happens might make us more creative or more successful. But at an emotional level, it's a little scary to look under the hood, as it were. Something I've been asking my students about are experiences when they felt creative, when they felt like they were doing work that was meaningful, important. And something I've noticed is that when they reflect on those experiences, they're not telling stories about times when they did great, when they made their greatest work. Those meaningful moments were times when they felt maybe a social connection, like the work mattered to someone, a friend, a relative, a community. Times when they were challenged, they tried something new and they were able to figure it out. Maybe it was a new material. And times when they felt like they had autonomy, like it was their project, they owned it. It wasn't something someone else was making them do. I guess, my question for if there's a neuroscientist in the room is, how do we encourage the kind of self-reflection that can, lead to a deeper sense of creativity in our own work?
Well, Perini is the neuroscientist in the room.
I'm the cognitive scientist.
Cognitive scientist. Oh,
Anna,
sorry,
the
neuroscientist. I'm sorry.
Well,
yeah.
Neurocognitive scientist, but Anna's the neuroscientist. She's hardcore. I mean, not that I'm throwing the ball around, but I'm still taking notes. Yes.
I think Well, I don't know if I can answer that directly, but I would say what is fascinating to me about everything that all of you said is, for one thing, we seem to think about space as some things that we need to do about it, and spaces tend to be quite inflexible. The word that came out in all of our discussions before was flexibility. And I'm wondering about, and then that seems to be one of the things when you think about creativity and you're trying to think in creative ways, the danger is that one can't because, or is for whatever reason, because you're led down the path of least resistance. So how do you think in ways that go against it? It's partly being aware of what are the things that lead you down. So the brain is built to be efficient and fast, and not necessarily to try and do the hard thing of coming up with something. It's not built for that, but it's the same sort of the same tools we have when the brain's sort of been built to be a sort of receptive predictive machine, and we use the same machinery. I don't like that metaphor, but let's stick with it, for the generative explorative cycles that are required under conditions of creativity. So partly it's an awareness of what your why it is hard, and then to shake yourself to do something new. So the ideas that Perini brought forward about some of Gardner's work and so on, of the thing to increase fluency, get ideas is come up with new ideas is actually lots of different ideas is actually quite easy. If you take any person and do almost anything, tell them to do something that they're not accustomed to doing, they will suddenly have more ideas. The originality, it depends, I think, partly in terms of one's advice for practice depends partly in terms of, is it enough to just have a lot of ideas to feel loosened up to just come up with a lot? Or are we going for a higher metric, which is to be more original? And that kind of stuff can't really be fixed in a sort of temporary, short-term sort of fix. It takes discipline, it takes practice, and I think that there's something about practice that I'd like for you to discuss, both in terms of space and practices and processes, because we seem to suggest that there's something about the space that if it's boring or something, it might impinge on our ability to be creative. But what about the flexibility of a space? A lot of the time COVID, Perini mentioned all of the changes that we've had in the workplace now, and that things are never really going to go back to the way they used to be. What is the impact of working in a space that is familiar, that is known? Does that push us to being more safe, or does the safety is what we require to pushing ourselves to new horizons? That's one thing I want to think about in terms of where what level of structure is good to push us, and when do we both physically, but also, I'm happy to speak about collaborative processes as well. I think that would be really fruitful, but there's something about the lack of flexibility of space that is a little bit counterintuitive to this process. So I would love your thoughts on that.
Can I jump in? Because I hope we can make some connection there. Thanks, Anna. And so I think about, so when we think about spaces as being inflexible, I think it's a question of what we do with it. We're humans, right? So are we going to treat it as something that is inflexible? Or so by that, two quotes come to mind, and now I'm going to put my artist hat on. But there's a quote by Proust, which was that the real voyage of discovery. We do have an assumption that as artists, and Mark talked about artistic almost myths, right, as to how we create. But also there's in the writer's world, there's an assumption you go to Paris and everything changes. There's a little bit of that trope, or at least you go to another country and suddenly you can write. And I'm really interested by artists who've taken a different point of view. Actually, a French writer, Proust, who said, the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes, right? And Proust famously didn't actually travel very much. Or we think of Emily Dickinson, who's a fascinating character who really didn't move beyond her bedroom almost. And yet she did not go to Paris in that way to kickstart her writing. So here's somebody who is, Anna talked about rigidity, when space becomes rigid. Here are times when what we're looking at is saying, it's not just the space, it's what you do with it. So Proust is prompting us to say, let's be aware of how we space our physical spaces could well prompt routine behavior and habits if we let it do so. But if we take the same space and rather than going with the flow, but deliberately with an awareness of how our brain mechanisms work, with exactly, Anna, as you said, that knowing that we are receptive, predictive machines, if we create internal triggers, ideas to shift that, what can we do to then look at exactly the same office space in a completely radically new way? You know, Shelley, who went to the oldest college at Oxford, the poet, well, he was actually a scientist when he was at Oxford studying electricity. He said, poetry is the art of making the familiar unfamiliar. So at least in that writing practice, and I think poetry particularly, is about taking, so often the great poets have taken an object and described it in a way that makes you really see it in a very new way, but it's the same old object. So you can think about Pablo Neruda's Odes to Common Things, which is a masterpiece of small poems that are each looking at things such as a chair or a plate, but helping us see that in a different way. And that process is one of resisting routine. So Robert Haas, our US poet laureate, famously said, poetry is about saying no to the plausibly constructed world. So a chair is no longer a chair, it's something else. So I just wanted to leap in with some, like how we, my thoughts on that as the process of resistance, that you can use space, you can use its routine boredom and challenge it, and that is can often be more surprising than being in a completely new space, although being in a new space and going to Paris is of course wonderful.
To follow on from that, you know, thinking of space as fixed, we tend to then assume that our relationship to space is static. And I think that what these ideas from poetry are stressing is that viewing that relationship as dynamic and not just a one way, we're perceiving it, it's there, we sense it, but thinking of that as more of a dialogue that's always changing, that's dynamic. If we think of space as one element of environment, you know, we tend to think of as more dynamic. We think of interactions with environment. And I think that, you know, it's difficult to conceive of a redundant space as a dynamic presence. But in terms of my own creativity and ideas that surprise me, learning about actor network theory, where that wall has agency, and its agency to change me changes as its environment changes, as the night crew passes through and cleans off that smudge from someone who fell against it yesterday. Those are all still affecting me, and trying to be open to the passive environment as active is like a change of mindset that I think goes with the ideas that you're saying about, you know, not accepting it for what it looks like. And I think that's one of the things about thinking about interactions with other people, is that you can cultivate those interactions so that they maintain that element of surprise, even in a static space, and also are part of the network that keeps changing every time. And you know, the conversations that I've had with Mark over the years, where we initially think we're talking about the same thing, and I realize, you know, an idea has taken on a whole new life form from the way Mark's perspective challenges me. That being open, and again, the practice of opening and listening and really seeing things through other people's or other things' eyes, I think is one of the ways that we've strived to maintain that dynamism that you know, can be challenging for some of the sort of emotional reasons that Mark was talking about. And you point out too that as expertise goes up, your receptivity to new ideas decreases, and your creativity decreases with that. Having that cognitive flexibility constantly reinforced by the relationships you maintain with physical spaces or relationships with people, I think is an exciting area to, I'm really interested in what you're doing to, as a consultant working to create these spaces, because for environmental problem solving in particular, you start off by saying that we have a dearth of creativity, and the world needs it a lot right now, new solutions. So that's kind of where we've been spinning it, is thinking about how to turn static seeming relationships into dynamic relationships, as a way to create that novelty and surprise.
Yeah. So much to say, and so many. I mean, you've now generated lots of questions. So Anna, I think you should keep us here all day. Lizzie, well, I'm going to end this with a question back to you and Mark, but quick answers in terms of the bringing people together who from different perspectives is there's such wonderful work on the importance of doing that, and Anna probably knows this work too, but for example in Yale Medical School there's been now several years where cohorts have come through and they've engaged with art. I don't know, Mark, if you probably know this work, right? So there, and it turns out that 2 hours of an extra 2 hours of looking at art and thinking about different looking at art that has nothing to do with medicine actually improves your ability to do medical diagnoses versus an extra 2 hours of medical knowledge and information. So that importance of so it really underlines the importance of cognitive flexibility in so much of the work that we so much of the professional work that we're trying to train, where there's always been an assumption just more the accumulation of knowledge is enough. And here it's showing accumulate so far, but then also have places where you don't get stuck in the Dunning-Kruger effect, where you're able to challenge yourself and to have internal prompts. So that's one comment about that. You asked about, in terms of environmental, how this applies to looking at environmental problems. So one of the biggest things that I've run into is, and this also applies in terms of art making as a solution to climate change and climate change action, is that we're at a stage now where the American Psychological Association estimates that the majority of Americans are suffering climate anxiety, whether or not they believe in climate change. So they're suffering climate anxiety, but unfortunately at the same time we have a lot of artists who are very generously wanting to be involved in climate change, producing art. But when you look at the art, again, let's be more nuanced about this. The art is very often about information transfer or pointing to the threat. And it serves the function of being spectacular, memorable, probably gets more funding. But ultimately, the viewer walks away and 2 days later is less likely to engage in climate change action. So what is the art really doing there? So that's, a big question I have. And yet there's also wonderful examples of art, such as I think of the artist Michelle Chauffeur in New York City, who does a work nocturnal medicine, where there's a way for artists help scaffold people's emotions as they think about climate change, the fact that many of us feel anxiety, stress, even grief. And the art now becomes a scaffold, helping people to think through their emotions and therefore then have brains that are more open and able to be more cognitively flexible. Because we do know, Barbara Fredrickson's work, the psychologist Barbara Fredrickson, shows that when your attentional focus is broadened, when you have positive emotions, your attentional focus becomes broader and you are therefore more likely to come up with innovations, right? So just to touch on that idea of art and environmental space, so that's one of, as you were kind enough to ask, Lizzie, that's one of the things I think about as a consultant. Well, firstly, I'm very curious to hear what Mark thinks about this, but I'm also so curious to hear more about how you actually engage with, as you said, how do you cultivate these interactions of surprise with other people?
Yeah, I really appreciate that read on art as being able to do a lot of different things in the world. You know, it is not just about persuasion or communication. And I think one of the reasons why this is such a rich area around which to think together is, you know, art can galvanize people around difficult ideas. And artists have in their toolkit creative misuse and subversion and ways to help us get inside complex topics. I'm also appreciating this notion of the creative environment as being dynamic. You know, that it's a place where we can engage, go for a walk, but also be able to retreat and have that privacy. And I'm thinking now, you know, as you were describing those elements, I was reflecting on my experience at Cranbrook Academy of Art, which was a total environment designed by Elio Saarinen, a Finnish architect, that has a track record of being, you know, a generative environment for creative people. And it has that quality. Parts of it are monastic. You can go hide in a studio and make work all day. But it also, the layout of the campus invites walks, strolling, you know, just exploring. And the thing that I remember is that there are parts of the campus that are highly decorated, and there's statuary and, you know, typography and decorations, but there are also places where there are niches that are empty and there are pedestals that don't have work on them. And just having that imaginative space to think about what could go there is somehow part of what makes that environment special.
Yeah.
Do you want to also talk, Mark, about some of the ways to generate that openness through interactions that you've developed tools for?
I think one of the most surprising and encouraging things from our work on this project, which has artists and environmental scientists doing creative work together, is realizing that creativity is not the sole domain of artists. And another thing I'm thinking about are those moments of, let's call them discomfort, of trying something new, or of having your identity, professional identity or expertise challenged because you're around other people who have other ways of framing those ideas. Benefits from reflection time, of stepping away, and for that group of people to come back together maybe a few days later. And it's sort of fascinating, what is shifting, you know, in that time in between.
So a tangible example of one of the exercises that that's one of the workshops that we've done the most involves collaging, and it seems to have a pretty profound effect on both the art students and the science students in a very short period of time, especially maybe more the science students. I don't know, Mark, but it brings up a lot of the challenges that Mark just mentioned in the course of one exercise. There's a giant pile of photos and textures, flat images. Everyone has to make a collage quickly. But the next step is then people have to muck with each other's collages. And that moment where you're giving up working on your own and having to meddle in someone else's mental space takes a moment. You see the people go through this discomfort, yet it's the task, it's what everyone's doing. So they do it, and then they have to combine their collages with their neighbors. And so there are all these interesting moments. And what we both found so fascinating is that no one talks. They just start moving things around, and it's this nonverbal dance that each group finds a way to navigate. And by the end of it, they have more confidence and a newfound enthusiasm for this idea sharing that all happens so subtly. That's really beautiful to watch. So those, I just wanted to make sure that some of the actual tools that Mark has developed get mentioned, because I think for me as a scientist, it helps me see what these abstract ideas actually look like, and has been a big part of how I've come to appreciate the importance of these collaborations, and really gotten to see what they do empirically by watching these students dance so beautifully together and clumsily, and laughing and stressing. And one of them so nervous she was almost crying. I mean, it's all over the shop. But you know, that novelty was there many times in an hour period, that students got to experience in really new ways. So just as a sort of tangible example.
How fascinating. I mean, that sounds brilliant. I wish I could have been there to see it. Now I want to see it. But I'm curious, what was your prompt when you asked the students or the gathering to make the collage? Was there what type of collage? I mean, was there a theme or an environmental question you were addressing?
Not really.
No.
It's really about materials and, sort of starting with simple rules, putting things together, and then putting things together with another person.
Great.
And now your group puts things together with another group. And as Lizzie mentioned, the room was kind of quiet. It starts out with a lot of sliding, and then ripping and crumpling and stacking. Just the sound environment alone tells you about how people are taking greater risks as they realize, their sense of ownership is being challenged.
Can I jump in here to ask all of you to comment on what I'm trying to see what's common to everything that you're saying? And I think what each of you are trying to make a case for using different tools and processes and ideas is how to essentially inculcate or cultivate or tap onto a sense of openness that we sort of lose perhaps, and that you can either cultivate a space or an interaction like that, where it sounds a lot like play, what they do there, where it's sort of how play is defined as sort of time limited space, a specific space and time where there are some rules, but otherwise it's completely rules. It just provides enough structure. And I wonder if you would agree or disagree with the statement that each of this is really about letting people get away from this path of least resistance by perhaps not the discomfort part comes later perhaps. So while you're working collaboratively, that the discomfort it's interesting. It's very different from working on one's own, because the discomfort is almost possibly sometimes publicly it's just obvious, or you're not sure what to do, or people are privy to the fact that you're not really sure what to do here. It's quite different perhaps when you're in a quiet space by yourself. But do you think that openness is the central point to flexible? Is all of this just to get people to just a what if? I want you to go into a what if space, and I want you to, and the words are great though. I think that the fact that they lost words is really interesting, because we know from some empirical work in creativity that when you ask people to verbalize their process, it actually interferes with their work. It just gets in between capacity to be intuitive and have these sort of subconscious things float around. So I'm not, that's wonderful that you saw that. But would you say that at the core of it, what are we trying to do there? Is the openness piece? Is it just making people, this is all about just discovering something new for themselves, even if it's on the most micro level of analysis?
I can offer just a quick response, which I think that play and openness is important, but obviously we don't want to be playing, we don't want to be silly all the time. So I think part of what we're trying to understand or teach or help people figure out for themselves is that play, that openness has a role in the process, and we should probably afford it more time than we generally do, but it's part of a total process. It's not the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I would add to that I think that awareness, so step one is an awareness of how, as you said, we're predictive machines, how our brains work. So we work with our brains instead of against them. So knowing that we have these cognitive traps in a way as to how the brain, if you let it, this is what it's going to do. And then that allows us to step back and say, okay, what can I do to change that? So the exercises, the activities that Mark and Lizzie have been refining, perfecting, these are all wonderful ways to stop us in our routine, to make us think, and to then ask us, maybe the next step beyond that is to say, what are all the other places, not just when we're in the art studio, the arts laboratory, but how can we, each of us in our daily lives, engage in such a way that we're not constantly on routine, and to also surface the fact that so much of design and so much of what we are interacting with, including technology, pushes us into this idea of efficiency, which I would very much question what is the definition of efficiency, but we are already, here's the human brain, it has its constraints. You load on top of that a whole bunch of design decisions and tech decisions that make it even more constrained rather than liberating it to actually access its full potential. So either we can change everything, rebuild every building we're in, rebuild every piece of tech, or we can come in armed, as it were, with an understanding of how our brain is going to be reacting to all these different things, to physical spaces, to tech spaces. And with that knowledge, have a chance to step back, and take more control and agency. I recently read something which I think just kind of shows where we're at these days. But writer Libby Copeland talked about the fact that she is now terrified to shower because of that it's being alone with her own thoughts, because everywhere else outside the shower, she's got access to tech and constant stimulation and constant new ideas and constant, the white noise. And the shower is one of the last places. And I thought that was unusual that she said that, because it turns out that the Pew Research Center recently noticed that 33% of Americans are actually showering with their iPhone. So, wait till Libby finds about that. So these ideas of, if we know that, we can take charge of our own showering, using the shower to be a mindful space, or just a free space to say it's okay to not be working in the shower. Yeah. It's good for us.
I'd like to take one question that we ought to comment, and I'd like as the last thing we deal with, which is a comment from Pio Chayanon, who says he's a former architect. To come up with new ideas, we have different preferences in terms of the quality of space and environment we're in. Some love high ceilings, me, and some like small cozy spaces, for example. I think this will be the same in other fields in schools as well. I think what he's getting at is so we're proposing that there are systems of spaces that are ideal, but there's a lot of individual differences. So how do we accommodate this critical factor of that we are all, well, Libby doesn't like showers, I love showers, right? So what can we say in terms of generalities that would apply to the specifics of the individual as well? And I think that will be our last. I'd love all of your quick comments on that before we close at 2:59.
Well, going back to what Mark said about, spurring creativity being one step in the process, we all need to be somewhere we feel comfortable and safe most of the time. But mixing it up is not a bad idea. walls are static, but lights and sound and smell aren't. Those are ways
Yeah.
that I tweak my environment, especially lighting, to change the way I feel and think differently when I get stuck. But I do have a favorite for sure.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Lizzie.
And I think the choice of tools are important. You know, for a musician to have the proper instrument, for an artist to have their favorite brush, their pencil, to feel that resonance with a tool is part of the process.
Right.
Final word to Perini.
My contribution would be to say that there's that when cognitive psychologists have looked at that data around ceilings, there's some really interesting work where you can take the same person, put them into different rooms, different size ceilings, and see the way in which their ability to answer problems changes radically. So low ceilings, very good for detail orientation. You know, those kinds of problems. If you're in a high ceiling space, much more holistic thinking, much more divergent thinking. And that was tested across a whole range of different genders and ages. However, so the answer, but perhaps the answer is just having that knowledge means that you can then take your own agency and say, well, what type of problem? I'm doing a spreadsheet right now. I should be in a small, it's better for me to be in a small space. Or I'm doing big thinking. I'm going to, you know, and let's build buildings where there are this different, just like the campus that Mark mentioned, places of retreat, privacy, niches, but also, you know, wide open spaces, places for walking, that there is a range. And I think that when architecture embraces cognitive science, we'll all be feeling a lot healthier. So yeah.
That's wonderful. I think that's, yeah, I like that idea of creating a space that's multi-purpose, the kind that Mark was referring to as well, but that should be a norm in all our workspaces, with perhaps institutional settings where we pay attention to the research, as Perini has made a very, very strong case for, I think, here, to say, well, we are dynamic people, dynamic creatures who need to basically can use our environments effectively, and we just need to know what's good for a specific kind of cognition that we're trying to attempt, and that when we're aware of this, we can design spaces to be multi-purpose, and to not think of just one way, think of it as a dynamic thing that we want to aim at. I want to thank all three of you, Perini for taking the time, and Lizzie and Mark jumping to the chance to be part of this panel discussion as well. Thank you to all of the participants who are listening in. I've noticed all the chat comments, and I will send them to our speakers, so that there's some questions as well with your emails, with emails included. So if you could answer those questions, that would be great to each of our speakers. Thank you all for being here. And the next session starts in about a minute. So I hope you get to that and you enjoyed the session. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you, Mark and Lizzie.